Welcome to this special edition of the Casual Shooters Podcast, your premier podcast for the casual shooter. Everyone knows that I endorse the use of Hoist beverages as a hydration beverage. Chris Gelnett swears by it now after using it. And with it being summer, I decided to reach out to a subject matter expert and talk about hydration and heat injuries. This might very well be the most important podcast you've ever listened to. My guest for this episode has a PhD in sports medicine, owns his own consulting company, and is the Associate Director of Sports Medicine Research for the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So if you would, join me in welcoming Dr. William Adams to the show. How you doing, sir?
Hello, how are you doing?
Good. Have you ever had an applause when you joined a podcast before?
No, I think this is the first time that I've had an applause in a podcast. So I'm quite honored to be on this podcast this afternoon or evening or whatever people are tuning in from.
Exactly. I mean, literally they're around the world, so it could literally be any time zone.
There we go. No, it's great to be on the show, and I'm looking forward to chatting.
Awesome. If you would, go ahead and take a moment and introduce yourself.
Yeah, no. So I won't add too much context. So, I do have a PhD, and actually, I'll back up for just 1 second. So, my background, I have a clinical background. I am an athletic trainer, so I did my undergraduate work in athletic training, and I have clinical experience in providing healthcare services to high school athletes, to collegiate athletes, but also in mass participation events. So thinking of like Boston Marathon or Marine Corps Marathon or the Falmouth Road Race. So those very large events, there's tens of thousands of athletes participating. From a research perspective and background, my training is in exercise physiology and specifically in and around thermal and hydration physiology. So really, breaking that down a little bit further is most of my work has been in and around the prevention and care of heat-related illness, but also how we can optimize human health and performance from a hydration perspective. So yeah, that's a real brief overview of kind of the work I've done and where I'm coming from.
Holy cow, that's pretty impressive. That's all I'm going to say. Now, had I known that I was going to have you on before, or the timing anyway, I could have just waited to start my physical therapy on my torn meniscus till I had you on, since you're an athletic trainer. I mean,
yeah. I mean, I could have done my best, but too bad the timing didn't work out better.
Yeah. I mean, isn't all rehab done virtually anyway? I mean, just kidding. All right. So you got it. So obviously the Marine Corps Marathon is only an hour, if that much, 45 minutes to an hour away because it's Northern Virginia, DC area. Mm-hmm. But what is the Falmouth Road Race? I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, the Falmouth Road Race, it takes place in Falmouth, Massachusetts. So for those that are unfamiliar where Falmouth is, it's in Cape Cod. So if you look at a map of Cape Cod, there's kind of an elbow of Cape Cod that is closest to Martha's Vineyard. So Falmouth is in that elbow of Cape Cod. So it's a 7-mile road race. The road race technically starts in Woods Hole, which is right next to Falmouth. And it's a 7-mile road race that goes along the ocean and finishes in Falmouth. It takes place in the middle now, toward the end of August. I think it's the third weekend in August this year. But yeah, it's a pretty competitive race. There's runners that are from all over the world, competitive professional runners that run this race, and then you have an additional, almost 13,000 runners that are participating every year.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Holy cow! Talk about a traffic jam. Good Lord.
Yes, that's absolutely. After working the medical tent, you usually just hang out on the beach for about 2 or 3 hours. The finish line's right along the beach. So once you're done treating the patients and runners coming into the medical tent, hang out, get some pizza, relax at the beach for 2 or 3 hours, and then you're still stuck in traffic trying to get back over the 2 bridges. But at least you can hang out on the beach after you're done working.
All right, I'm going to write down a question because I'm I'm going to go, since you do large events like that, I'm going to come back to that later and we'll talk about things with that.
That sounds great.
Before we get into that, though, I've got to put you through the grinder and ask you our icebreaker questions, which some people find are the hardest questions that they answer the entire podcast. So, question number one, favorite movie?
Oh, favorite movie. If I had to pick one, I mean, there's a number. And I was having a conversation with my colleague earlier today about movies, and one of the things that came up, and I would say it's probably one of my favorites. I would say probably top five is Happy Gilmore. It's an old one, but you
Oh,
can't
yeah.
you
Classic.
can't yeah, you can't go wrong with Happy Gilmore versus Shooter McGavin. I mean, that's just a classic movie right there.
Wrong price, Bob.
Oh yeah, it's a classic. I'd probably say
Oh,
that's in my top five, and based on the conversation earlier today, I'll bring that out as my favorite for this episode.
I like it. I like it a lot. Now, what I have learned doing this podcast over the last almost 3 years is reading is a lost art.
Hmm.
However, you're an educated man. You've had to read a lot of things. What is your favorite book?
Oh, that's a great question.
I told you they're hard.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of a recent book that I've read for fun. A lot of the reading I do is journal articles or whatnot. I would say actually I think one of the relatively recent books that I've read that's really stuck out to me and I've used to really adapt a lot of my everyday kind of workflow is a book called Deep Work. And I believe the author is Cal Newton, and if I'm wrong, and if Cal is listening to this, I'm sorry for messing that up. But no, I think that book is. I really enjoyed reading that book, and the whole context of that book is how can we be more effective in our work. And he introduces this concept of deep work and trying to remove distractions from our everyday work life that may not be needed and are distracting us from really completing our tasks in an efficient and timely manner. So yeah, I think that's probably one of my more recent favorites, just because of the takeaways that I brought from that or took from that book.
Interesting. Okay. Have you applied anything from what you read in there to your everyday work life?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, I'll see. I try to as much as possible. I think I think there's room for growth as in anything. But yeah, I mean, in my normal work day, week to week is trying to identify blocks of time where I can pretty much block out that time to focus on things that need to be done, whether they're upcoming deadlines or if there's a paper that I'm looking to write to get into peer review to publish. Blocking that time out. Not responding to emails or calls or texts, and really focusing my time and effort in completing those tasks. So
Okay. I noticed I don't work in an office and I haven't in the last 20 years as a paramedic, but I noticed before that when I did work in an office that having music on, upbeat music helped me keep a better pace of work. Whereas if there was no quiet, it would could just, I mean, if it was all quiet, it just seemed to like everything slowed down. I'd get
yeah,
tired. It's like, ugh.
yeah. For me, it's music is good, especially if I'm trying to write or really think. I'm the opposite. It has to be like classical music, and there can't be any vocal.
Mm.
It has to be just music.
Oh,
Otherwise, my mind doesn't work that well, especially if I'm trying to read and comprehend and understand something. So yeah, music's great, particularly if you're in a coffee shop and put your noise canceling headphones in
oh
and,
yeah.
and block out everything else for a few hours.
Yeah. I don't recommend ASMR for that. So
Yeah, no, probably. Yeah, that probably would not. I know I would not be.
counterproductive.
Yeah.
All right. Now, the question normally is favorite superhero or historical figure, but with your background, I'll even add in if you don't have one of those, you can go scientist.
Mm. Ooh. I think the
So you have a
biggest thing is,
choice.
yeah, which person am I going to choose? I think yeah, that's a good one. I think let's go with like the superhero route, and from a superhero perspective, um, I'm a Marvel guy, right? So between DC and Marvel, I'm going to stick with my Marvel side of things, and going through the whole Avengers series, and really kind of seeing the evolution of that whole timeline. I'll say one of my favorites is Iron Man, right? He comes across kind of crass, and yeah, I mean, he comes across as kind of egotistical, but I think the thing for me is really he always has the you know and really toward the end of the series, right? He really sees the good in people, and really takes his skill set, in this case, his thinking, his ability to think and solve problems, and make a really good decision. So I think thinking of that entire series, and seeing how the character kind of evolves, and toward the end, particularly in really understanding the value and the importance of really just people in general.
Yeah, and I love his sarcasm too, at least the character in the movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
They picked the right guy to play that part because he does it fantastic.
Yeah, and maybe maybe it's the character, right? Maybe it's the individual playing the character, and just that combination there that makes him such a compelling character in the movie series.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, of all of your time thus far, from the time you started college until now, all of the studies you've been a part of, which study surprised you the most with the results that you got?
That might be actually the toughest one yet. I think one of the ones that really stands out to me, and and not necessarily, and I wouldn't say necessarily that the results surprised me. It's I think the importance of the results, and I think what can be done, and then the take home from the results. So in my current role, we had just published a study in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. And what we did was we went back to our existing data set, and looking at the mental health screening tool that we utilize for our Team USA athletes. And it's a toolkit that the International Olympic Committee developed in 2020 and rolled out. And we have implemented that into our sports medicine program, and use it as a screening tool for our athletes ahead of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So thinking of the athletes that were competing in Tokyo and Beijing for the Olympic and Paralympic Games, they completed this toolkit. And the way the tool was initially set to be rolled out was a 3-step process where athletes would complete an initial screening questionnaire. And if there was a positive screen, or if the score in that questionnaire exceeded the set threshold in that validated questionnaire, the athletes would then be requested to complete the next step 2, which is 6 additional validated questionnaires. And if the scores exceeded the set threshold on there, then there's a recommendation to be referred to one of our psychological services providers for a follow-up, just to make sure that there was no issues, and if there were, making sure that the athletes received immediate support and proper support to help them as they're getting ready to go to Tokyo and Beijing and whatnot. I think the cool thing at the foresight of our senior director for psychological services, being a new tool, a new toolkit, we decided as a department and organization, well, our athletes should complete both steps 1 and steps 2, because there was no evidence to say that step 1 predicted outcomes in step 2, and step 2 is that key factor that indicated whether or not the athlete should be referred to a mental health provider or not. So our athletes completed both steps 1 and steps 2, and then that allowed us on the research side to go back and analyze that data to see, hey, how well did step 1 predict step 2? And for us, we were looking at it's called false negative rates. So false negative rates in this context would be, well, an athlete would not exceed that threshold in step one. So in the way that the tool would be meant to be rolled out, they would not move on to step two. So there was no flag on step one, but they would have had a positive screen or a flag or exceeding that scoring threshold on step two. So that is of a concern for us, because if we were looking to use the toolkit the way that it was intended, we could be potentially missing some individuals there. So false negative rates are important, and false negative rates are percentage. The lower the percentage, the better, meaning that we're doing a better job of not missing anyone or potentially missing one. The higher the percentage, the potentially the higher likelihood of missing someone that may need to be referred and followed up with. So we found false negative rates between almost 5% and 66%. So a huge range of rates, and we were able to identify some of the questionnaires in step two that may not be the best tools necessarily for elite athletes. But more importantly, I think the big take home for us and really what we put into the paper was, well, hey, knowing the range of false negative rates and knowing how serious some of these things are within the questionnaires as far as what they're getting at, we made the recommendation, athletes should complete steps one and step two regardless. And then that should be really factored into that decision in the referral process. That way, clinicians and providers are minimizing the chances of potentially missing someone that may need some support. So, I think for me that has, yes, it's most recent. It was just published last week, and it is open access and freely available to download from the British Journal of Sports Medicine website. But I think that has the biggest impact, knowing how important mental health is. At least from a sports medicine perspective, we have the physical health, like the musculoskeletal injuries, the illnesses, but the psychological health is just as important if we're looking at health and wellness and also performance. So, having some results such as this and the takeaways that we are mentioning within the paper and the conclusions is really important. I think it's going to have a tremendous impact, not only within elite sport, but sports at all levels that they can utilize to really optimize the health and wellness of athletes participating in sport.
Okay. I actually did see and started reading through that, but so since you brought it up, I'm going to ask, so they created this thing in 2020, but was there an event that triggered the need for this? And what are they trying to prevent? Is this a performance screening, or is this and I mean mental health performing, or are we talking mental health as we know it from a medical standpoint where, we're talking depression, anxiety, whatever?
Yeah, I would say the latter, looking at the clinical events that can occur and mitigating that. And really the toolkit was really born out of a consensus statement that the IOC published in and around this topic, knowing that mental health has been a concern, and in very with some of the athletes around the world using their voice and vocalizing the concerns and struggles that they've had. I think it's really brought this topic front and center, and big organizations such as the IOC are like, hey, we should go back and develop some recommendations and best practices to one, screen things and making sure that that teams and organizations are well positioned to care for individuals that may have some of these concerns. So, I think it's an ongoing thing. I don't necessarily think it was a single event that really led to this development. It was a byproduct of the consensus statement that was developed. As far as, hey, we have this consensus statement. Here's some recommendations that sport programs can then utilize to build an effective mental health or psychological services program. But we're also going to produce a toolkit to assist you. It's like, here's a good screening tool that can be used in addition. So I think they were kind of the SMAT, the screening tool, was born out of the consensus statement.
Okay. Now, is there any plan to give them so is there a baseline though? Like when they first come to Colorado Springs, do they get that so you have a baseline and then later you give it to them again down the road and be able to measure the differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the answer to that is really largely unknown. Seeing as this toolkit is relatively new,
Right.
we don't really know how often or how frequent that should be given to athletes to complete. For us, we give it to the athletes going into a games period. When they fall under our care. There are some sport organizations that are doing it more frequently, and there's other time points that we will have athletes come in that will deploy that tool as well. But there really aren't any recommendations to suggest like it should be done in XYZ time frame or frequency. Um, However, with that comment and really the lack of literature in around there, we're collaborating with one of the IOC research centers in South Africa on a project to explore that. Where we're hoping to get this project off the ground here in January, and we're hoping to recruit a very large sample of athletes from around the world
Mm,
to complete this tool. The plan is to deliver this tool every 4 to 6 weeks and do it for 12 months. Across that period of time, we'll be able to see that individual variability across time. We'll know what sports they're in, so we can kind of track what their season looks like going into across the year. And from that data, we're hoping to get some reliability metrics of the tool to see how reliable it is with repeated measures, but also to start to see some of the variability and start to sparse out, when would it be best to have this tool delivered and deployed to athletes to make sure that we are doing a good job of having an informed timeline for this episodic screening.
right. I mean, you do it long enough, you'll figure out
Mhm.
where in the timeline they start to show, where there may be an issue. So
Yeah, yeah.
very interesting. Okay. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk about, because when I first reached out to you, I was reading some different studies and stuff. You seem to have done a bunch of stuff with heat related illnesses and injuries. Um, Specifically, I was reading one where you were looking at ice baths versus other forms of reducing core temperatures and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, and I found it interesting because when I was in the Marines at Quantico, we had a Marine who had a heat injury, and literally, I drove this Chevy Blazer, the compact size one, with a corpsman and this Marine in the back with the tailgate down, and I was getting it down the road. It's completely unsafe, but got them to the clinic. They threw him in an ice bath, and then they, brought his core temperature down, shipped him off. And a couple of years later, I heard people saying, "Oh, that's the worst thing in the world." So I thought it was very interesting that, oh, look here, it's later in the 2000s, and they're saying the ice bath is the best thing. So can you walk me through that and why that's the case?
Yeah, no, that's a great comment. And oftentimes the ice baths are terrible. That's going to put someone into shock or potentially cause
Yes,
cardiac
exactly.
arrest,
Yeah.
or they're going to warm up because they're going to start shivering. Those are common misconceptions that are still used in discussions. There's a good paper a paper that we published in 2021. So in the Journal of Athletic Training in 2021, there's a consensus statement or a series of consensus statements, and this one is led by Dr. Kevin Miller, who's now at Texas State University. And the whole purpose of that consensus statement, and it was titled um, um, oh, it was a roundtable on preseason heat safety in high school athletics and in high school athletes, but it was really in and around the pre-hospital care of exertional heat stroke. And the purpose of that consensus statement was to highlight what are the common myths and misconceptions in and around management and care of exertional heat stroke, and what is the evidence to refute those myths there. And that was one of the myths that was brought up was an ice bath or cold water immersion is not not an appropriate cooling modality. So, for those listening in, feel free to tune into that. The Journal of Athletic Training, that those articles are freely open and accessible to the public, and it's a great resource to have. But to answer your question, I'll back up a little bit and provide a little bit of oversight from exertional heat stroke perspectives. I think that kind of ties into my answer and response.
Okay.
So with an exertional heat stroke, well, I'll back up one step even further just to kind of differentiate when I say heat stroke, right? So when we're thinking of heat stroke, we have two different types of heat stroke. We have classic heat stroke, and this is what you would normally see in an elderly individual or an infant, right? So thinking of an infant that's left in the car, or an elderly person that may be at home, no air conditioner, and there's a heat wave, right? So that's classic heat stroke, and really the environmental heat is overwhelming the body's thermoregulatory capacity. So the ability for the body to manage that thermal load. Well, if that load is high enough or long enough, well, they can have a heat stroke, right? Their thermoregulatory system just fails. So that's classic heat stroke. With exertional heat stroke, and with the word exertion, that is caused by physical exertion, right? So these are individuals, whether it be athletes, whether it be soldiers, whether it be laborers, that are physically exerting themselves to the point of having a heat stroke, right? And you're thinking, well, how does that happen, right? Well, as we're exercising, or if we're out on a mission in the military context, or say we're out in a road construction setting, or roofing or whatnot. If we're exercising, doing activity, we're needing energy to do that work, right? We need energy from our bodies to do that work to withstand that period of time. Well, from an energy perspective, our bodies utilize glucose, and we break down glucose for energy to then do that physical work. Unfortunately, as we break down the energy within our bodies to do physical work, our bodies are terrible at using that energy fully for work. So we probably only use maybe around 15, 20%-ish of energy to do work. The rest of that energy that's being broken down within our bodies is given off in the form of heat.
Oh, wow.
So if we are out exercising, we're producing body heat that we need to get rid of. And if the intensity of the exercise is higher, more heat's being produced. And if our bodies can't keep up with losing that body heat in the way that we're at the rate at which we're gaining it, well, body temperature is going to keep on going up, and it could get to the point where an exertional heat stroke may occur. So all that to say, if we're thinking of an exertional heat stroke perspective, since it's physical exertion related, we need to cool the body temperature. We need to cool the body down, and we need to cool it down quickly. Our bodies, we can only withstand a very high body temperature for a very limited period of time before we start to have proteins denature in our bodies, before we start to have tissues break down, before we start to have organs shut down, before we start to have the bacteria that's in our intestines, which when it's in our intestines is good, but when it leaks out of the intestines into our circulation, that's bad. So, to help minimize those risks, we need to cool the body down as fast as possible. So then you're asking, well, how do we cool the body down as quickly as possible? Well, water is an amazing convective source of heat transfer. And when I say convective, I'm really meaning and thinking back to physics, right? When I took physics, convection is the transfer of heat via the movement of air and or water across the skin surface, right? So if I have air on a windy day, if I have air going over my skin surface, that air is going to be removing heat from my skin. And
that's why fans feel so good.
Exactly. And same with water. However, the benefit of water is it's about 26 times greater. The power of the convective properties of water are about 26 times greater than air. So it's like, oh, cool. Well, if I can put the body in water, particularly cold water or ice water, now I have a huge thermal gradient between my skin and the water. And if I'm circulating that water and really maximizing convection, I can rapidly change body temperature because of that movement in the convective properties. So if we're thinking about treatment of heat stroke, and the goal of treatment is to lower body temperature down to about 102 degrees Fahrenheit within 30 minutes of a collapse, let's just use the modality that has the fastest and highest cooling rate, which is immersing someone's body in cold water. Now, going back to the myths and misconceptions, well, what if it puts into shock and this, this and that? And I guess there's always a risk, right? There's never a non-risk. I know in my professional career, I've treated over 70 patients with exertional heat stroke. My friends and colleagues, if we combine all of the exertional heat stroke patients that we have treated in our collective careers, we're probably nearing almost 1,000 patients. And there's also really good literature in scientific and medical journals that are highlighting big case series, whether it be in road races such as the Falmouth Road Race, and we can kind of get back to that if you have a follow-up question, or like the military. And if we're immersing people into a tub of ice water to cool their body down rapidly, not only are we saving their life from exertional heat stroke, to my knowledge, there's no known adverse events from putting someone into a tub. And if we cool them down quickly enough, to our knowledge, based on the literature, there's no long-term complications. Where if we delay cooling, or if we use a suboptimal cooling modality that delays how quickly we reduce body temperature, that's when we start to see people that may have long-term complications, or I guess more morbidly, this is when we see people dying from exertional heat stroke, is because their bodies are overwhelmed with that injury. So yeah, that's that. And I guess going back to the risk component, right? One of the things, what if they have a cardiac arrest and they're in an ice tub and you can't put an AED on them? Well, take them out of the tub, dry off their chest, put the AED on, shock them if it's a shockable rhythm, do CPR. Once their heart rhythm is restored and they no longer have a cardiac arrest, they still have a heat stroke, so put them back into the tub, right? So it's really kind of thinking logically through that process of, okay, well, I'm going to treat this emergency, this medical emergency. If another medical emergency occurs during the same time that's more emergent, I'm going to treat that first, and then deal with the condition at hand. So, I think there's ways around that if it were to happen, and it's really more about the preparedness and making sure that, okay, well, we don't know that there's no record of this occurring. However, you can never rule it out completely, so we should be prepared. So if I'm going to have a cold tub to treat a heat stroke patient in a medical tent in a road race, I should probably have some AEDs around as well, just in case. So yeah, I think that's my really long-winded answer to your question. But yeah.
Yeah, but it was thorough, so I'm okay with that. But I'm with you on the side of being a first responder. I've shocked more rhythms into asystole than anything else. So it's very rare have I literally shocked a shockable rhythm where they didn't have a pulse and immediately they got sinus rhythm and, oh, they're back. I mean, that works great in the movies, but not in real life. So, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, they're already in shock. So you're stopping that shock process, because that's what heat stroke is. It's everything you were describing were symptoms of shock. The intestines becoming porous and everything leaking out. So yes. All right. So that is obviously the absolute worst case scenario. Somebody they get hot and they end up in heat stroke, which is a life-threatening situation. So I was also looking at some other ones that are more recent, and there's two of them on my screen right now. So I want to move from heat into hydration, because obviously that's a big component of that. And the two I'm looking at are the utility of thirst as a measure of hydration. And because there's also some old wives' tales with that. But that may actually be a little true. And racial and sex differences in 24-hour urinary hydration markers, which I thought was very intriguing, actually. But thirst as a measure. It was always told to me that once you're thirsty, if you become thirsty, you're behind in your hydration, which is not inaccurate. But what I thought was interesting in the findings was you can drink water and basically satiate your thirst and still be inadequately hydrated. So what would be so for someone who doesn't have access to a lab and they can do a urinary analysis every 24 hours, what's a better indicator that they're hydrated?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that was a fun study, and maybe I should have brought that up in when the question you asked before, because I really enjoyed doing that study in of itself. I think from a recommendation perspective, and I do not want to discount thirst. I think thirst is a great perception that we as humans have that can
Mm-hmm.
really kind of help guide us. And to be honest, if our dehydration is severe enough and our thirst sensation is that high, fortunately, that sensation overpowers, or that perception overpowers everything else in our body. So we will do nothing until we quench that thirst, right? So we are going to seek out water to quench that thirst as a protective mechanism. So, I think thirst is a really great perception or sensation that we have to at least I'll use the word alarm us that, hey, I'm thirsty. I should probably find some water, right? And knowing that the more we're dehydrated, the stronger that sensation, and then the more likely we're going to find that water quickly. I think from a daily recommendation perspective, I think there's kind of two frames of thought, or two approaches to this. One, we need to be worried about day-to-day hydration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yep.
as a subset of that, we need to be worried about hydration in and around physical activity. And let's just say a sport practice, say football practice, right? So those two things really kind of should be married. And I think oftentimes, not oftentimes, I would say sometimes those two thought processes really aren't combined together. It's thinking of one versus the other, and sometimes there's some misalignment there. So I think from a recommendation perspective, I think we need to make sure that we are consuming an adequate amount of fluid throughout the day, right? And that could be driven by thirst, right? If I'm in my desk and say I don't have a water bottle in front of me, and I'm like, oh wow, I'm thirsty. Well, I should probably get up and go get something to drink, because I'm probably behind in my fluid for the day. But you may ask, well, what's adequate? How much should I be drinking on a day-to-day basis? Well, that's kind of mixed. And there's two kind of standards. We have the standards here in the United States, so from the Institute of Medicine, and the recommendations for men are about 3.7 liters per day, and for women it's about 2.9 liters per day. Now, that is all fluid intake. So that is also the water that's included in foods, right? So, if I'm eating an apple, right, that has a pretty high water content. So those volumes are also inclusive of the water we're consuming in our foods that we're eating on a daily basis as well. And I guess you can consider that, if I remember correctly, that's factoring in about 20% of water is coming from food. I could be off a little bit,
Okay.
but about 20% of water that we're consuming is coming from the food we're eating as well. So there's the Institute of Medicine values, so 2.9 or 3.7. But there's also European standards. So the European Food Safety Authority has guidelines, and those guidelines are 2 liters per day for women and 2.5 liters per day for men. Now that's solely fluid intake, so not accounting for those that are in foods as well. I personally, I like using the European standards a little bit better, because it's easier to control, particularly from a research perspective. If I know that, say women should be drinking 2 liters a day and men should be drinking 2.5 liters a day, and if I want to conduct a really well-designed study, well, I'm going to go out and buy some bottled water and say, hey, you're going to drink these 4 bottles for the rest, throughout the entire rest of the day, or you're going to drink these 6 bottles, right? That way it's easy. It's easy math, right? So I like using that just because I think there's more control in and around just the fluid intake in and of itself. So that's how we should really be approaching just day to day, right? Day to day, I should be meeting adequate intake recommendations. And how to do that? Well, being strategic, having a plan. That could be, if you're out doing work, if you're a construction worker, or say you're even working indoors in an office, right? Having access to fluids and water, right? Having a water bottle next to your desk, or making sure you have access to fluids out in the job site. Having access and the visibility, you're more inclined to wanting to consume fluid because it's right there and available to you. Now, the other frame of thought in and around activity, and let's just use sport because it's easy, right? So say a football player, they're going to go out for football practice. And let's just say practice is 2 hours. Well, if they're consuming fluid and meeting those recommendations throughout the day, well, they're going to start practice probably normally hydrated, which is great. They're going to go and exercise. They're going to sweat, right? They're going to lose body water because of the sweating response to help regulate body temperature. Ideally, fluids should be readily available during that practice. So people are probably going to consume fluids. For people who have very high sweat rates, or if it's hot and humid outside, or you think of your big lineman who is a high body mass, they may not be able to consume fluids at a rate at which they're losing it. So there may be a deficit by the end of practice. Well, knowing what that deficit is, and then knowing what that deficit is, and adding it to the remaining amount of fluid you need to drink for the rest of the day, and having that mentality is going to really kind of help optimize the individual from being normally hydrated day in, day out. Now, you may ask, well, how do I know if I'm dehydrated when I wake up? Like, I don't have access to a lab. I can't, pee into a cup and look at the concentration. There's a couple of things that you can do, right? You can get up every morning and you can weigh yourself. Go in, go to the bathroom, take your clothes off, get naked, weigh yourself. And keeping a track record day in, day out, there's gonna be some variability, and those acute changes in body weight are really driven by water losses. Whereas over time, then we're gonna see some weight loss or weight gain depending on other dietary behaviors or exercise behaviors therein. But from day to day, any variability is really based on water balance, based on how the body operates. So, if I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna weigh myself every morning. I can see what that difference is day in, day out. And if that difference is, say, greater than 1% of the day before, hey, I may be in a larger deficit than the day before. So I should probably consume a little bit more fluid today. And when I say 1%, that's really kind of what is well acknowledged as that normal day-to-day variation. Every day, our body water should be fluctuating plus or minus 1% for a number of factors. When it exceeds that 1% threshold, that's when we're starting to be like, okay, I'm probably veering way outside of that threshold more than others. So, a first morning body weight can be good. A first morning thirst, right? If I'm gonna wake up and I'm thirsty after sleeping for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours, I probably did not do a good enough job the day before of being hydrated. And that sleep period is a good time to kind of fast yourself from water. And waking up thirsty, I may need to consume more fluid today. And a third marker that can be used is that first morning urine void. So I'm going to get up, I'm going to go to the bathroom, I'm going to weigh myself, I'm going to urinate. I can look at the color of that urine, and the darker the color of that urine, the more concentrated it is, meaning the body is wanting to retain more water in our body. So those three metrics are pretty good tools to use. And in 2003, there was a paper published by Dr. Sam Chevrant and Dr. Mike Saka that introduced this diagram and this model of taking each of those metrics and creating a Venn diagram where, okay, if my thirst is high, there may be a chance I may be dehydrated or I may need to consume more fluid. But if my body weight is outside 1% and I'm thirsty, okay, there may be a greater likelihood I may be dehydrated. But if all those three are formed together where, okay, I have dark colored urine, I'm thirsty, and my body weight is outside 1% of normal, it's pretty likely I'm dehydrated and I need to address that. So those are some simple things that people can do quite easily. Most people have a scale. I mean, some may not, but most people do.
Right.
You can easily wake up and say, hey, am I thirsty today or am I not? And I can look at my urine. So those are some good ways to do that. And actually, myself and some colleagues are working on a paper right now where we looked at those three markers across about, I think, 300, almost 350 days worth within people. I think almost 80 people. It's been a little bit of time since I've seen the paper as we're revising and everything. But we have all those three metrics, and we did some modeling and some higher level statistics, and we were able to determine, how much each of those metrics kind of weight against each other. I won't spoil it now, but we found some interesting findings, and in that those variables, they're not equally weighted. So we can use those three metrics, and using more than a single one or more, 3 versus 2. It's just a potentially better indication for us in the lay population that doesn't have access to, extensive equipment to say, hey, am I doing a good job of hydrating myself or not? Now, that approach is retrospective, right? If I'm waking up and I'm thirsty, I have dark colored urine, and my body mass is off from normal, I did a bad job the day before. So it's really kind of reflecting, did I do a good job the day before? And if I meet all those metrics, I probably did not. So today, as my day is starting, I should probably do a better job this time.
Okay. Now, would you guys ever recommend for people who have to do multiple day events?
Mm.
Would you ever recommend litmus paper to give them a better idea of where they are in the hydration scale?
Oh, that's a good question. To be honest, I'm not sure. I've never really used that technique to look at that. So yeah, I'm really not sure. I really can't offer any advice that
Okay.
for the folks listening, because I don't have any real background in that.
Okay. That's fair. And the reason I ask that is like when I sent you the information earlier, there's one woman that I was talking to where she was competing at a match and also assisting. So
Mm,
she performed one day, but then she stayed the next 2 days to help out. And the whole weekend was hot.
mm,
Summertime, so it was hot. It was muggy. Like right now, well, today it was 96 degrees here with humidity. Tomorrow it's supposed to be 98, feel like 105 with the humidity. Um, but like in her case, she had an incident at a match or where she was assisting and lightheaded, dizzy, the whole, classic signs of, okay, you need to sit down, you need to hydrate, you need to do this. Um, and her and I were talking. So I recommended some things, but for because she then started to feel it another time after
mm.
that. So I'm like, all right, you're starting to show signs of, being prone to these things. And I don't know if it's, just her hydration situation or electrolyte imbalances or exactly I mean, you get dehydrated, then you have electrolyte issues too. But for those people, I'm always curious of things outside the box, like for her, not for everybody, the normal people, I don't see a need for it, but for those specialized individuals, I could see, well, maybe I wonder if obviously I know nothing to back it up, but I'm like, I wonder if litmus paper would help her know where she is in the morning to give her a better idea of how much she needs to consume during the day if she didn't do enough yesterday to keep from dropping to that level. Um, and for those people that are prone, is there any type of guidance as well? You're not on those days, you're not going to be the 2 liter woman. You need to be the 3 liter woman. Is there any type of guidance like that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think going back to my example before, kind of outlining recommendations, I think that's where even we as scientists could do a better job of translating, what would be best suited for individuals. So to your point, right? Maybe day in day out, if someone's just living a normal life, maybe 2 liters of fluid throughout the day is enough. But say now they're going in and assisting with a tournament or competing in a tournament, and now there's extra stress in the body, right? The activity and heat stress. If it's hot out, the body's going to lose more water because of sweat. Well, they need to replace that sweat loss, because the body is going to be pretty standard to that 2 liters per day. But if I incorporate an additional stress, whether it be exercise, heat, or both, there's an added stress and an added response, right? So we need to account for the additional response. So you're exactly right, right? So say someone is normally 2 liters a day and they're normally hydrated. They wake up, they're not thirsty. Their body weight stays consistent day in, day out. They have light colored urine, but then they're going to go on and say compete in a tournament and say they're going to be outside for 8 hours. Well, hopefully they're able to consume fluids throughout the day. It may not be enough, particularly if they're not, meeting up with their sweat losses. Well, that added stress is going to need to be accounted for. So instead of 2 liters, hey, I may need to consume an extra liter because I'm already in a deficit after my long day outside in a hot environment. So yeah, it does take a little bit of time to really kind of fine tune what each person needs. And I think that's the other tricky, complex part is each person's different. Like my sweat rate, I'm a pretty heavy sweater. So if I'm
Me
gonna go
too.
outside and exercise for an hour or more or whatnot, I know I'm gonna be pretty dehydrated. I'm gonna come home. I'm gonna have the sweat marks on my face. I'm gonna be
The
pretty
white
thirsty.
t-shirt, even though
Yeah,
it's black.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I know that I need to make sure I am strategic throughout the rest of that day to have additional fluids because it was evident how much I lost, right? So, but each person's way different, and it's really understanding what each person's needs are, and that may be some trial and error. That may take some time to really refine and know how much fluid do I need, and everything.
All right. So let's also then, now that we've talked about fluid in general, let's talk electrolytes. Have you done much with studying of those electrolytes in fluid loss and heat injury?
Yeah, not so much in the context of fluid loss and heat injury. I did a study. When I was in my previous role when I lived in North Carolina, and it was funded by Hoist, and we were looking at in this case how well Hoist did it at retaining fluids in our body. So how well it did it in hydrating us. So we had people come into the lab on two different occasions where one and it was randomized. So they came in one time and they had one experimental condition, which was either Hoist or distilled water. And then they came in another time and they had the opposite experimental trial. So they did both. They came in, we gave them a set amount of fluid that they needed to consume over the course of 30 minutes. So we gave them 1 liter of fluid. And then for the next 4 hours, we tracked their urine output. And the reason we did that was, if we track urine output, we know how much body water, we know how much water or fluids they consume because we gave them a liter. And if we track urine output, we know how much water is leaving their body because their kidneys are filtering it out.
Right.
And if we see differences there, then we know that one beverage may be better than the other. In that particular study, we found that Hoist did a better job of hydrating someone than just plain distilled water. And it was statistically significant, which makes sense, right? With Hoist, it has electrolytes, it has other nutrients in there. And we know based on physiology that if I'm consuming fluids or foods that have macronutrients, so calories and carbohydrates or protein or fat, that density is going to help absorb that fluid in our intestines better than just plain distilled water. And distilled water, there's nothing in there. And it doesn't really taste all that good at all because there's nothing in there.
Yeah.
So, obviously in that case, yeah, it was more hydrating. And I think our overall conclusion was, Hoist was 110% better hydrating than just plain distilled water, right? So 10% better in retaining fluid in our body. Now, there's been other research that's been done in quite a bit looking at different types of beverages. Dr. Ron Mon and Dr. Susan Charest, who they are researchers in the UK, they have published a series of studies looking at various types of beverages, whether it be your oral rehydration solutions, such as like a Pedialyte, for example, that meet the WHO standards, or like a sports drink, or like milk or coffee or alcohol or like apple juice. They looked at all these different beverages and they developed this beverage hydration index, meaning, hey, if my retention capacity is above this threshold, then this beverage may be more hydrating than others. And what it came out at the end of the study was, yeah, those that are more energy dense, they're going to be better hydrating because that density, as it's going through the stomach and the intestines, is going to help the absorption of water into the body. So from a fluid perspective, that is good there. And obviously, when I say macronutrients, I'm also referring to also the electrolytes, the sodium, the chloride, and all that stuff too.
Okay. Why distilled water? Just because there was nothing in it?
Yeah. We wanted to really compare, what's a fluid that has nothing in it that we can really control for. So distilled water was great because we know there's nothing, there's no minerals in there, there's nothing. So we can really tease out the true effect of this other beverage, and in this case was Hoist there. So that's what was done, and it was really mimicking what the previous researchers had done with that controlled trial with distilled water. So from a replicability perspective and a replication perspective and being consistent with previous literature, that was one way that we can have control over those results from a methodological perspective.
So did any of the participants call you guys mad scientists for giving them distilled water?
I don't think so. I mean, if they did, they did so when I was not in the lab and my students were in the lab. So,
I'd have been like, "Oh my God, what are you giving me? It's terrible."
But to my knowledge, I don't think so. But I could be wrong. I'll have to talk to my students after and debrief with them.
Right. After they graduate, they're like, yep, I sure was. They weren't going to admit it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man. Yuck. Okay. Interesting. So I guess that's the other thing. The other thing I told her too was, so the other part of this I wanted to talk to you about was like for me, I'll drink maybe one in the morning, before I'm going to a tournament or whatever activity I'm doing outside. And if it's all day long, then I'll drink one again at the end just to help get that in. But I'm drinking water the rest of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so for her, I said, look, maybe one in the morning, one at noon, if you're going to be out all day, because then you at least, that stuff's going to get absorbed quick. And I said, drink water in between all of that. If you're still thirsty at the end of the day, drink another one and then water the rest of the time just to try to help her keep ahead of it. Um, is there any recommendation for electrolyte replenishment, or is it just water for
Yeah,
hydration?
that's a great comment. Or a great question, actually. I think from my perspective, yeah. At first, I'll just say, first water. Like having the water is going to be helpful.
Right.
When we're thinking about electrolyte replacement in and around exercise, and whether it be a hoist or another sports drink, for example, when, because people always ask me that question, when should I choose to drink a sports drink over just plain water? And my recommendation typically is, well, if we're doing intense exercise in hot environments or it's prolonged, so prolonged meaning like 75 minutes or greater, it may be helpful to incorporate a sports drink into your fluid intake regimen in addition to water, right? And I think there may be some added benefit there. Um, One, you're consuming water, right? There's still water in those sports drinks. You're still consuming water.
Absolutely.
One, and it probably tastes good, right? It probably tastes better than just plain water. So I may be more apt to wanting to consume more fluid, which is also good because I'm consuming more water.
Right.
From an electrolyte perspective, yeah, from an electrolyte perspective, I have not myself studied this, but based on the literature, I'm not sure how much of an effect in electrolytes in a sports drink really have in fluid replacement during exercise. And the reason I say that is if we're looking at like a normal sports drink, it's about the concentration of the electrolytes in there is probably 6 to 8%. So very small concentration of electrolytes in that beverage based on the volume. But if we're comparing that
Mm,
electrolyte content to the electrolytes in our blood and our plasma, that's going to be much greater. So if we're consuming that and it's going to get into our intestines, um, you know, our bodies are going to, and based on fluid shifts, it's going to be based on osmotic gradients.
right.
So having those big differences may not drive any additional fluid per se. Now, there is some evidence to say that just the greater concentration of that sports drink, because it has other macronutrients in there, that creates an environment in the intestines that's going to help promote absorptions, right? So we know that there's going to be increased absorption. Now, is it just electrolytes, or is it also because there's carbohydrates and sugars in there? Well, it's probably because there's carbohydrates and sugars in there as well that's driving that, because it's making that much more concentrated and changing that gradient. Um, so I think from a pure electrolyte perspective, I'm not sure how much of a factor that may play into there, but the other nutrients that are in that beverage may assist in the absorption of that fluid into the intestine. But I think from an exercise perspective, I think the other benefit of sports drinks is the fact that it has sugars in there, right? So if I'm outside and I'm exercising and I'm utilizing energy, well, I should probably replace some of the energy. Otherwise, I'm just gonna I'm gonna bonk at the end of the day or the end of that match or game or whatever. So that sports drink is going to provide a quick source of sugars and energy that can help replace some that's being lost. So that's another benefit there.
Mm,
But I think day in day out, I think water is your number one go to. The downfall of those sports drinks is because it has sugar in there, and we know that added sugar into our daily diets has the potential to increase risk for other comorbidities
right.
that have lifelong implications. So my first go to whenever I give recommendations to people is just water, right? Water is going to be your go-to source. If you're outside all day, if it's intense exercise, if it's hot outside, yeah, feel free to consume some sports drink or another beverage, and add that to your food and your strategy, because it is going to assist. I wouldn't necessarily drink solely that, because your stomach may not like you at the end of the day if you're drinking a high sugar beverage all day.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but incorporating that in there might be very helpful.
Well, and some of the newer hydration beverages have much lower sugar content than
Mm,
like the old school original Gatorade,
mm,
which was
mhm,
almost like soda level sugar content.
mhm,
So they're a lot better. I like that. But I've always been of the mind that take your high school football player, okay? He's having heat cramps, he's on the verge of heat exhaustion, okay? Or maybe he's reached it. I've always been a proponent of, as a paramedic, I don't just want to start an IV and give him normal saline. I'd rather give him lactated ringers because he has sweat out other things, not just water or
mm.
fluid. There's sodium in there because you see the sodium all over the shirt and everything else. I feel like, there is that point where you can create a bigger problem if there is an electrolyte imbalance and you just add more water to the issue. So that's where, so the sodium chloride helps, but I still feel like the added ingredients, those macronutrients you're talking about, benefit those people at that level. Maybe not the normal person, but for them at that point, to help prevent them from getting to that, bringing their temperature down, getting them properly hydrated with everything that they need, prevents them from going to that final step, which is where we're trying to keep them out of.
Mm, mhm.
Has there been any, so as far as then there isn't any real study as to the type of electrolyte at this point of sweat we need to consider these replacements or
Yeah, that's a great question. Off the top of my head, I am not aware of anything, at least that I've read it, that has really explored that. And I think that's a great, topic and thought, because, given how individual our fluid needs are and our responses, our the body regulatory processes that our bodies undergo, some of those approaches do need to be individualized, and to what extent, right? So I think that's an excellent
right,
question. But yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone that's really fully explored that. Now, that's not to say that no one has in the past, and I'm just not remembering that. But yeah, I mean, that
right,
that is a great thought as far as how do we optimize the potential to replace not only the fluid losses, but electrolyte losses. Particularly those electrolyte losses are quite high. I think one of the things, at least here in the United States, and for many people that live or consume a westernized diet, I think in part that's beneficial, because I think it's pretty well known that we overconsume sodium anyway. So I think that
yeah,
here, those that are consuming a westernized diet, I think there's a little bit less of a risk. But those who may have different dietary behaviors, for whichever reason, and that sodium intake may not be that high at all. That I think that kind of goes back to your point. Like, there's a lot of individual
yeah.
influence and factors that may need to drive specific interventions and strategies to effectively manage that.
Now, I wanted to the other thing I found interesting when I was reading the racial and sex differences in hydration was that it seems like everybody is inadequately hydrated,
Mhm.
like on a daily basis. When I read the numbers, I was like, well, I was telling my wife about it. I'm like, wow, the numbers are crazy. Like let's see, where was it? 60% of men and 40% of women don't drink enough water.
Mhm.
Wow. That
Mhm.
is staggering, actually. And it looks like, but at the same time, from what I gathered, it looks like in general, men were inadequately hydrated 50% of the time and women almost 61%. Or do I have those numbers backwards?
No, I believe that's right. But I mean,
Okay.
they were close enough, but yeah, it was in the 50-60% range that they were
Yeah.
inadequately hydrated, from what I remember.
So clearly, we're not doing the 2 and 2.5 liters.
Yeah, no.
Nobody is.
Mm.
There's a few of them out there that are, but I don't know that I've met one. Maybe my wife. She drinks a lot of water. Holy cow. And it's funny because after I read that study, I drank 4 glasses of water. I was like, oh my God, I am so far behind. Now, and you guys did that over a week, correct? So
Yes.
I don't remember. So I'm going to ask like I did earlier. Was there a baseline before the test started? So you knew what their baseline hydration was, or?
No, so this is a great question. So the purpose of this was part of a couple of larger studies that we had conducted,
Oh,
and looking at hydration status as one of the outcome measures that we were looking at. So we left this as an observational design. We just wanted to see what people's behaviors were and try to minimize any influence that we had as researchers on their behaviors. So there wasn't there wasn't a baseline going into it. If anything, over the course of the week and whatnot, we got a good baseline because we knew what their hydration status was across a full week. So, at the end of the day, yeah, we have a good baseline because now we have a week's worth of data on these individuals.
okay. Now going back to large athletic events like Marine Corps Marathon,
Mm-hmm.
Boston Marathon, those things are big.
Mm-hmm.
Like people travel around the world to run in those two and the New York Marathon. There are certain ones that are the pinnacles of the marathons. Why people do it, I don't know. I ran 12 miles one time and I did it in 72 minutes flat. I swear I would never run that far again ever in my life. I left it was a Sunday. I was in Okinawa. So I'm like, I'm going for a run. I took this Navy corpsman with me. I got so bored. I'm like, man, I got to finish this run. So I took off. Guy told me he's never running with me again, ever. But so when you work these large events like that, what's the number one injury you see the most?
Wow, yeah. I'm gonna say it depends. If we're looking at,
Okay.
if we're looking at Falmouth Road Race, I'm gonna say the medical condition that we treat the most is heat stroke. One, because it's in the
Heat
middle of
stroke.
August. Yeah. One, because it's in the middle of August, right? And it could be warm or hot and humid in Cape Cod. And with a 7 mile road race, it's short enough for people to be able to run at a higher intensity for that long period of time. But it's also long enough to be able to drive body temperature up high. Right. So when you have
Hmm.
that, like that thing there, you can have a much increased risk of heat stroke. So thinking of those races, or say um, the big 10K road race in DC in the fall, but Beach Beacon road race in Maine is another 10K race. So thinking of that 10K, that 6 mile and a half marathon distance, so about 13 miles, that's that distance where, yeah, my intensity can be higher because it's not that long of a race versus a marathon where
Right.
I need to pace myself more, right? So that's where we're more likely to see these heat stroke events. So at Falmouth, for example, yeah, we're going to see more likely than not heat strokes. And I've volunteered as part of the medical staff there, probably since 2011. Obviously, during COVID there was no in-person race, so they're a couple of years off there. But that's where most of the heat stroke patients I've treated in my career have been, at that particular road race, just
Wow.
because of the nature of the event, of when it's held, the intensity, and also because it's hot and humid. Once they get past the first mile, they're running along the ocean for their 6 miles. There's really no shade cover at all. So if it's bright sun and hot and humid, that's just added environmental stress that they're imposed to. Now, that's that one race. Now, if we're looking at, say, Boston Marathon, I honestly, that depends greatly. I think it depends on the year. It depends on the weather. It depends on a whole host of factors. Where if it's say cold and thunderstorming all day, where there's a couple of races, a couple of years I've volunteered, it was downpour and raining for most of the day, if not all day. There's a lot of people that came in and they're very, very cold, or they came in and they just had blisters, or they were cramping,
Mhm.
or I think in those marathon races that are much longer, you see a whole host of different potential problems. Some are definitely more emergent, right? We do have heat strokes at marathon races. Boston has had heat stroke events that they'll treat, in the medical tents. But they'll also have, people with hyponatremia. So hyponatremia being they're consuming a ton of fluid and their sodium concentration is just very low.
Yes.
So we have those potential emergent conditions. But then there's other things, whether they could have fallen and scraped up their hands or their elbows or their knees, or they could, So I think marathon road races, you see a greater variability of people coming to the medical tent with complaints than some of these shorter races where we know going into a Falmouth road race, for example, we know that we're going to be treating 15 to 20 heat strokes today because that's been the trend
based on the weather and
based on the weather and based on the history. The race has been going on for 50 years and they're really well prepared. And if there's any, say if I'm going to run a road race and if I'm going to decide that day I want to have a heat stroke, I'm going to have a heat stroke at Falmouth because I know for sure that I'm going to be treated immediately, appropriately, and they're going to save my life there. So.
Okay, so you're going to plan it for there.
Yeah.
Okay. And I expect, like the marathons, I expect repetitive injuries like blisters and things like that. That I get. I was surprised for a 7-mile race that the number one injury is heat stroke. That's shocking.
Yeah. No,
wow.
I would say that's specific to that one road race, but maybe there may be other 7-mile road races where there may not be that much of a risk. But for Falmouth, and also that's my own personal experiences being there at that race. Yeah, that's going to be the number one complaint that comes in.
Wow. Now, how much of that do you think is just people not necessarily being properly prepared for a race like that?
Oh, that is a great question. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure if I can actually answer that. I think it's a whole host of different things, right? Someone could be out late night, late. They could be out late the night before partying because that's really truly the last weekend in Cape Cod before school starts up again. So that's their week of vacation. They're going to go out and party, and then they're going to go run this race. That could be an issue. They could be sick in the week beforehand, or they could. Maybe they had an injury from running and they were shut down, not being able to train as effectively. So their fitness may be low, their heat acclimatization status may be low. They can maybe they weren't hydrated, or maybe they didn't sleep well the night before because they were sleeping in an Airbnb or a hotel or something like that. A whole host of different factors can come into play internally, but then the environment plays a factor into things as well. I think one of the complicating factors with heat stroke, and I think one of the things that fascinates me myself as a scientist in this space, is we know all these risk factors contribute to overall risk, but we really don't have a good understanding as far as knowing that we have all these risk factors that are known, how much weight each of those factors has to overall risk, and the interactive effects of these risks. And I think as a take-home point, there was a case series published a long time ago, I believe in 2004, looking at heat stroke fatalities that had occurred in the Israeli Defense Force. So there was a big case series, and they highlighted six individuals that died from heat stroke. And in the paper, they highlighted factors that were responsible based on each of the 6 individuals. Well, the reason they died was because they weren't properly triaged and they weren't properly treated. That's why they died. And all 6 people had those pieces, right? Had they been treated appropriately, they would have lived. The other interesting thing was there's other risk factors there that may have predisposed them to the heat stroke occurring in the first place. So we know the lack of appropriate care killed them. But if we look across all 6 individuals and all the potential risk factors, right? It was hot out, or the intensity, or all the different factors in that table, they were all over the place. Not one person had every single risk factor, nor was one risk factor present in every single individual. So now you have this like perfect storm of, okay, well maybe one person may have been dehydrated and sleep deprived, and they went out for a training bout and they would have been fine. However, the person next to them had the same risk factors, they may have had the heat stroke. So it's like, okay, well, why did this person have a heat stroke and this person didn't, right? So the complexities in and around
Genetics.
what constitutes that is really fascinating for me, and it makes it really kind of hard to kind of answer those questions, like how do we fully prevent heat stroke from occurring, and I'm of the thought, like we can't prevent the incident from occurring 100%. We can do things to mitigate risk, but we can't prevent it 100%. What we can do is prevent death, right? And that's
Yeah.
where is there risk, and making sure that we're prepared, whether it be the proper medical personnel that are there and having the proper supplies there to make sure that we can recognize, assess, diagnose, but then also treat at the same time. And we can't prevent it, but if we're prepared and we see it, observe it, and diagnose and treat it, we know that we can keep them alive. So that's kind of an interesting part to think about.
Yeah. And I mean, if you can't come up with a formula to prevent it from happening, then the only thing you can do is go to the end and prevent them from dying. So
Yeah. Now
I
I'm
get it.
optimistic. I think that at some point, I think that we'll be able to develop a pretty good algorithm. But right now, based on the literature we have, no, not at all. And I think people are working toward that. And actually, I'm working on an editorial with a friend and colleague of mine to talk about that topic. Hey, here's all these risk factors. How do we approach this? Because ideally, it'd be great to prevent this 100%. We know we can't now, based on the literature. So what factors maybe we aren't thinking about, right? So her and I are working on this right now, and we're hoping to get this submitted and hopefully published. But it's really more of a call to action, like, hey, here are some other factors that aren't included that maybe are contributing factors and may explain some of these things that we aren't accounting for, and really moving things forward and developing a more robust model.
Just kind of getting other people to think about it
Yeah.
to get.
Yeah.
Okay. I did my usual, broke my rule. You were talking and I had a question and I was like, I'll remember. And I don't remember. It's horrible when I do that. I hate that because it was a good question. and it was just carrying the topic on because there was something curious about it. But now I don't. For the life of me, I cannot remember. Oh, that's terrible.
Well, I'm hopeful that it'll come back to you at some point.
Yeah, I'm hoping. Now, for athletes like in Colorado Springs training, I'm sure there's plenty of. I assume that the outdoor sports also train there.
Um, it's a variety of sports, and it really depends. I mean, we have some of our sports that are here, right? Thinking of boxing's here, wrestling's here. Those are indoor sports, but we have a whole host of
Right.
other athletes that come in and train. We have triathlon and cycling that are here. And depending if they're in the velodrome, if they're track cyclists, or if they're outdoors, or if they're a para athlete or whatnot, there may be some outdoor components to their discipline. But yeah, it's a variety, and it just depends on sports and where they want to train, and if they're coming in for a camp or not. So yeah, it's a variety.
Okay. So for those that might be training part of their time outside,
Mm.
are there guidelines there for increasing fluid intake, or is that just a personal thing where they're educated on hydration and they take care of that themselves? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think more generally, and I can't speak to any of our specific sports and what those strategies are, because I think it varies. Um, and
Okay.
and given my role, I don't have direct knowledge of how our performance staff are managing that. But I know actually that is a strategy that is focused on. I just don't know how they approach that strategy. But I think in general, I think it's really more of a education piece and a learn piece as well. If they're outdoors, um, you know, knowing what the fluid needs are, and I think oftentimes what I recommend people doing, if they want to know, hey, how much fluid am I losing if I'm outside, exercising, and let's just say that it's in the summertime, and say it's hot. I think here today was like 90 degrees. It's been the 90s the past few days here. Well, if I want to know what my sweat rate is, and if I'm regularly exercising outside, well, before I go and exercise, I'm going to my bathroom, get on my scale, get take my clothes off, get on the scale. Taking the clothes off is easy because you don't have to account for the weight of the clothes. Get my body weight beforehand. I'm gonna go and exercise. Ideally, if I'm gonna exercise for an hour, it's easy to make the rate easier. Go and exercise for an hour, come back, get naked again, weigh myself again. If I consumed any fluids, making sure I keep track of how the volume of what I'm consuming, and taking that pre-weight and that post-weight, there's gonna be a difference, right? There's gonna be
Right.
a deficit. Well, if I'm down, say, 2 liters in an hour, well, my sweat rate is, or I'm down 2 liters in an hour, and that's after accounting for the fluids I've consumed. Well, I'm in a 2 liter deficit. So then I need to go back and say, okay, well, is there any way that I can integrate additional fluid intake into my workout, right? And if I can, let's try to do that. Like, what are some strategic points? And if I'm out on my bike, okay, maybe I need to carry an extra water bottle with me, or maybe I need to make sure that I stop at this time point in the convenience store, or coffee shop or restaurant, to refill my water bottle, to make sure I have enough to get home, right? So being strategic as far as where can I incorporate more fluid intake into my workout to minimize that deficit by the end of that training period. Or more importantly, if there isn't any time periods to incorporate additional fluids based on what I'm consuming, and that could be just nothing available, or maybe I'm consuming a lot of fluid and adding more, I won't be able to manage it, gastrointestinally, making sure that I'm then consuming that afterwards, right? So those are some really simple strategies that people can take to kind of see where they are. Now that's going to change over time, right? Particularly in someone who's living in an environment that has 4 seasons. My fluid losses during the winter time are probably going to be much less because I'm going to probably be
Yeah.
sweating less. It's cold outside versus, in the summertime where it may be hot and humid, right? So, doing that periodically across the year, if you're regularly exercising outdoors, you're going to get a really good sense of how your body responds to the environment and your training. And over time, if you keep track and keep record of that, you're going to have an understanding of what your own needs are, and you'll be able to then incorporate it into your daily behaviors quite readily. So I think that's probably an easy strategy that people can take to know how much they're losing, how much they need, but to really kind of see what their data is as an individual, but then have their own intervention, change their behavior, change their strategy, which sometimes is hard for people.
Oh, sure. All right. So I want to take that a little bit deeper for a moment then. Let's take that woman. I'm going to throw out a random number because I don't know how much she weighs, and we're going to say 150 just for ease of math.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So 1% for her is 1.5 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say but at the beginning of the day, she weighs herself 7 a.m. and she weighs 150 pounds. She comes back in the afternoon after being out there all day and she weighs 145 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
How much can we expect that to be weight loss due to the generation of heat, which burns calories, which is going to cause you to lose a little bit of weight? And how much of that is water weight? And then part 2 is, how do we then translate that into fluid? Are we doing 1 pound equals a quarter or 1 liter? I mean, how are we translating this?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think to address your first question, right? Looking acutely, and when I say acutely, we're really looking at the day level, whether it be across the entire day or between a 2-hour practice, or whatever it is. At the day level, that's going to be solely water losses. Now, that's not to say there may not be weight
Mm,
losses from the energy, the calories that are burned. But I think on such an acute time scale at the day level, that contribution is to be very, very small.
okay.
Um, so primarily most, if not all of that weight loss is from water loss in and of itself.
Okay.
So that's something very simple to think that, if it's acute, the day level, whether it be hours in the day or across the day, that's going to be water losses there. For the next question with, how does that translate? Well, that's a great question. So, I think in and around a practice, and let's just say go back to a 2-hour practice again, because it's easy. And actually, let's provide another example. Oh, no, let's just, the day level's fine.
Okay.
So say they're down 5 pounds. Well, I want to replace that fluid, before the next day.
Right.
And the recommendation, is going to be about 150% of your losses. And let's say, well, 150%. Why is 150%? That's well above 100% of what I
Because you're
lost.
going to urinate it out.
You're going to urinate some of that out, right? So you're accounting for some of
Yeah.
those urinary losses, particularly on a more
Sure.
short scale. So thinking of like a football player that has 2-a-day practices, right? I'm going to practice in the morning. I have 4 or 5 hour break and then practice again. Well, that 150% needs to be consuming that in that period of time, knowing that, wow, that's a shorter period of time. I'm going to probably urinate a lot more. So that 150% is probably a pretty good number, right?
Right.
So that's kind of where we're looking to go, 150%. Now, how does that translate volume wise? 5 pounds. This is why I like the metric system. And I don't like using pounds and stuff here in the United States because the metric system is way, way simpler, right? So let's just say 5 pounds, 5 pounds.
That's why the Europeans use it, because it's simpler.
Yeah. So let's just say, just for the sake of the conversation, and I know it's not going to be the correct calculation. Let's just say 5 pounds. Let's just say 5 pounds is 2.5 kilograms. It's not. It's gonna be less than that. But let's just say it's 2.5 kilograms. It's easy. Well, 1 kilogram equals 1 liter. So if I'm down 2.5 kilograms because of water loss, well, hey, I should be consuming, 2.5 liters gets me back to baseline. But if it's more acute time scale, I should be consuming 150% of that. So that's probably about 3.5-ish liters or so, whatever 150% is of 2.5. So I should be consuming that much fluid before the next day, before the next event. So yeah, I like using the metric system because it makes more sense. It makes the math way easier, because then if you're using pounds, well, I'm going to use pounds. I should use ounces. And then it gets all, I myself get confused, but, thinking of ounces, if we want to go that, right. 1 liter is about 32 ounces. So if I'm down, 2.5 kilograms or 5 pounds, that's probably going to be about 75, 80-ish ounces. So then add some more to that. So you're probably looking at 100, 120 ounces, right? So you can do some quick math there, but
3/4 of a gallon.
So
there you go.
Yeah. So I like using the metric system when it comes to that, because it makes the math easier.
Okay, that's fair enough. I like to give the Europeans a hard time, so I gotta, I gotta, say that's why they use it, because it's simple. But I mean, I figured there had to be a translation there somewhere, somehow, some way, so you can determine that. So that I actually like that, because being a paramedic, but also a firefighter, I don't like the firefighting aspect of my job, not because of the fire and everything. It's because the gear, I already don't like heat. Heat and we literally hate each other. Have you ever heard, or dumb question, never mind. Have you ever experienced prickly heat?
I don't think I've ever.
You get that quizzical look. I'm going to say no.
Yeah, I don't think I've experienced it. I mean, I know what it is. I don't think I've experienced it. I'm not trying to reflect back in my life. I'm like, no, I don't think I've experienced it, but I'm aware of what it is. Yes.
Yeah, I have, in a jungle environment, and I was the only guy in my entire platoon that experienced it. And they're like, "What's wrong with you?" I'm like, I got a million needles in my back right now. I was like, I had no idea what it was. Someone had to tell me what I was experiencing. But that's why I don't like fire gear, because it just makes me hotter. Like literally, my body core temperature on average runs between 94 and 95. Like I when I injured my knee, they kept like, this nurse is like trying to take my temperature, and she's putting it in my ear and all across my forehead, down the back of my neck. I'm like, let me guess, it's low. And she goes, yeah, it's not reading right. I'm like, what'd you get? She said 94. I'm like, yeah, that's right. She goes, what? I'm like, that's normal. That's why I hate the summer. That's why I hate firefighting equipment, because my body core temperature is low. So as soon as the temperature gets above 70, I'm already starting to sweat, because I'm like, I need it colder. So I go to cold weather training. I'm the guy sleeping out in the snow with the tents, and everybody else like, this sucks. And I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. But my point here is that firefighting gear elevates your body temperature, and they have correlated long-term health problems with that in firefighters, because their core temperature gets up. But I like this weight thing because that might be something we can also incorporate in our stations.
Hmm.
Weigh yourself every morning before you start shift and every night before you go to bed. Weigh yourself
Hmm.
and make sure you're hydrating properly. That's something easy we can do.
It's very, very simple. Yes, very
Yeah.
simple. And you're right. I mean, it could be easily implemented into a firehouse. Heck, thinking of like a high school football team that has maybe 100 players. It's easy for them to do weight checks before and after practice. Like it's for programs that do it every day. It's like clockwork. They have their weight charts and they have all that. So yeah, it's something super simple that can be implemented, and it can really be quite impactful from just an overall one knowledge understanding perspective, and really helping to drive behavior change for the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really like that. That is very simple. So, and I mean, look, most what is medicine is weight based and it's in kilos. So it's an easy thing. We can all just weigh ourselves, convert it to kilos, do it again in the evening. All right, you're down 14 liters, Riddle. Go drink. So it'll be something easy. And it might help us, identify people that are chronically
Mm.
dehydrated
Hmm.
and maybe be able to help them so, their health will be better long term as well. Well, I never did remember that question. Unfortunately, I think it was just another subset of what we were talking about,
Mm.
but to expand on something, I just can't remember what it was. But was there anything that we did talk about that you feel that we didn't clarify well enough or we need to go back and
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think the thing that we're just chatting about, like what are easy strategies that anyone can use. And I'm hoping that the people listening in can take some of that away, right? Yeah, a body weight
yeah.
before an activity, or before the end of the day, or waking up and thinking about, hey, how thirsty I am and what colors my urine. Like, those are really simple strategies that can be utilized to help guide, like, hey, how good am I doing from a hydration perspective? So I think that's probably one of the bigger take home points here is, hey, there are some pretty simple solutions that we can do that don't need extensive or expensive equipment in a lab that we need to pee into a cup or provide a blood sample and all that.
Okay. Now I'm going to be following you to see when the litmus paper study comes out.
I'll look into that. Maybe what I'll do. I just had a PhD student graduate in May, and he's taken on a faculty role in Georgia. So I may be, hey Mitch, like I think I have a study idea that you may be interested in doing. So I'll bring that up to
There
him.
you
And
go.
see what he says, yeah.
I like it.
Mhm.
The other thing was, where do you remember the name of the study that they did in the UK that put all the beverages on a scale?
Yeah. I don't know the full title of the study, but beverage
That's okay.
hydration index is in the title. So if you type in beverage hydration index, you're most likely going
Okay.
to run across it. And I mean, you're probably going to run across a couple of studies that use that in the title, because there have been some follow up studies that have been done. But that
Okay.
should go back, and Ron Mon and Susan Sharefs are authors in that initial paper. So yeah, beverage hydration index, that should lead you to the original paper there.
Okay. It's like body mass index. It's beverage hydration index. BHI. I mean, I should have known that.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, I hope you're okay with me calling you Dr. Adams. Thank you very much for coming on. I think this was extremely informative, and I think people will get a lot out of it.
yeah. No, thank you again for the invitation. It's been great to sit down and chat about some topics that I'm pretty passionate about, and it's not every day
Yeah,
I get to talk about those things. So I'm glad that we were able to do so, and I'm hoping that those listening in are going to be able to take some nuggets out from this conversation and apply it to their lives.
absolutely. Well, again, I appreciate it, and I wish you the best.
Yeah, you as well. And yeah, I'm excited see how. Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to tune into more of your podcasts now after this great conversation. So
I love it. Thank you. Until next time.
Don't be a little bitch.
Yeah.